It was 8:42 p.m. on April 14th, 2024. A 911 dispatcher in Orlando, Florida, picked up the call, expecting the usual, an accident, a robbery, maybe even a domestic dispute. But what came through the receiver was different. There was no screaming, no begging, no panic. Just a single cold sentence. He lied to me. He lied to me for 8 years. Then silence. The dispatcher's fingers hovered over the keyboard, waiting for more. But the woman on the other end didn't cry, didn't breathe heavily, didn't say another word. It was as if she had said all she needed to. The line remained open, the soft hum of static filling the void. "Ma'am, are you still there?" the dispatcher asked. No response. "Ma'am, is anyone hurt?" Nothing. The dispatcher's training kicked in. If a caller didn't respond, protocol dictated tracing the location immediately. Within seconds, the address appeared on the screen. Lake Ridge Estates, a quiet, gated community. Law enforcement was dispatched, but what they would find was nothing short of a nightmare. Police arrived within minutes. Lake Ridge Estates was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. The kind of place where neighbors waved at each other over trimmed hedges and kids rode their bikes down the sidewalk at dusk. But tonight, something was wrong. The house was a perfect picture of suburban serenity, except for one detail. The front door was slightly open. A single strip of warm yellow light leaked from inside, illuminating the porch. The air felt heavier here, as if it carried the weight of something unspoken. Hand signals exchanged. Guns drawn. The lead officer nudged the door open with his boot. It creaked, revealing a dimly lit hallway leading toward the master bedroom. Still no sound, no movement. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. They moved forward. The hallway led to an open bedroom door, and inside they found her. A woman sat on the floor, her hands resting limply in her lap. Her white blouse was no longer white. It was soaked in red, and beside her, slumped over the bed, was a man. The officer's eyes darted between the two. The woman showed no fear, no resistance, no reaction. The man's eyes were open, staring, unseeing. The mattress beneath him was dark with blood, dripping onto the hardwood floor. 3 bullet wounds, 2 in the chest, 1 in the forehead. The officer's stomach twisted, execution style. And the woman? She wasn't trying to run. She wasn't trying to hide. She wasn't crying. She just waited for them, for the consequences. Pastor Daniel Whitmore. That was a name they found on the IDs, the framed certificates on the walls, the bookshelves stacked with religious texts. The officers knew the name. A well-respected preacher, a leader of faith, a man whose sermons filled churches to the brim. He spoke about marriage, about love, about trust. Now he was dead. The murder weapon, a 9mm Glock, lay near his wife's feet. It was his gun, legally registered, kept in his bedside drawer for protection. But tonight, it had been turned against him. Rebecca Whitmore, 38, did not resist when officers lifted her to her feet. She did not flinch when they handcuffed her wrists behind her back. She did not ask why, because she already knew. In the back of the patrol car, Rebecca stared out the window. Her breath was slow, controlled. No tears, no shaking. Most suspects pleaded. They swore they didn't mean it, that it was a mistake, that they blacked out. Not her. When they arrived at the station, she answered every question mechanically. Name, address, age. But when they asked, "Why did you do it?" she lifted her head, met their eyes, and said with no hesitation, "He lied to me. He lied to me for 8 years. Then silence. No further explanation. The officers exchanged glances. Something about this wasn't right. The news of Daniel Whitmore's murder spread fast. A preacher? Killed by his own wife? The congregation was in shock. This was a man who had spent his life preaching about honesty, family, and trust. A man who had counseled troubled marriages, helped struggling couples. But behind the perfect sermons and warm smiles, Daniel had secrets. Rebecca knew, and now the world would know too. Because the truth was, Daniel Whitmore had built his entire marriage on a lie, and it had finally come crashing down. Secrets have a way of unraveling. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes years. For Rebecca Whitmore, it took 8 years of confusion, of silent prayers, of whispered apologies to a God she thought was punishing her. She had spent her career as a fertility nurse, helping other women overcome their struggles. And yet, she couldn't fix her own. Every doctor told her the same thing. There's no medical reason you can't conceive, Mrs. Whitmore. But if that were true, then why? Why had every attempt, every test, every painful injection, every round of IVF ended in failure? She had wept in sterile hospital rooms. She had blamed herself in the silence of their bedroom. And all the while, Daniel had sat beside her, holding her hand, promising that God had a plan, telling her that miracles take time. And she had believed him. Because who wouldn't believe a man of God? Hope was a dangerous thing. It kept her going, and it kept her blind. She had memorized every fertility cycle. She had injected herself with hormones until her body felt like it belonged to someone else. She had done everything. And every time the test came back negative, Daniel would sigh and pull her close. God's timing is perfect. Rebecca, we just have to trust him. She had clung to those words. Until one day, they weren't enough anymore. Because if God's timing was so perfect, then why was she the only one suffering? Why was she the only one being tested? The doubt crept in slowly, like rot beneath the surface. But the final straw came in the form of one simple request. April 10th, 2024. Rebecca's doctor suggested something new, a full fertility workup. For both of them, it was routine, normal, a standard step when a couple struggled to conceive. We should test Daniel too, the doctor said. Rebecca agreed immediately. Of course they should. But when she brought it up to Daniel later that night, his reaction was strange. He didn't look at her. He just kept folding his shirt, pressing the creases between his fingers. I don't think it's necessary. Rebecca frowned. But why not? Because it's not me, Rebecca. It's you. That's what the doctors have always said. Her stomach twisted. They've never actually tested you. Daniel finally looked at her. His face was calm, but his jaw was tight. You need to have more faith. Faith. That word again. A shield. A weapon. A way to silence questions that weren't supposed to be asked. But Rebecca was done with blind faith. So, later that night, while Daniel slept peacefully beside her, she made a choice, one she could never take back. The glow of the hospital computer screen illuminated her face. Her hands trembled as she typed in his name. Her nursing credentials allowed her access to patient files. It was illegal, a violation of privacy, something she had sworn never to do. But she did it anyway. The screen loaded, and there it was, Daniel Whitmore, patient record, Central Florida Urology Associates. A procedure date, 2016. A single word next to it, vasectomy. Rebecca's breath left her body. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might pass out. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some clerical error. Daniel had chosen this. He had gone to a doctor, sat through the consultation, signed the forms, and then he had come home and kissed her goodnight, like nothing had changed. For 8 years, he had let her suffer. For 8 years, he had let her believe she was broken. Rebecca gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. Every doctor's appointment, every failed attempt, every silent night where she had cried herself to sleep, all of it had been a lie, a carefully constructed deception. And Daniel had watched, held her hand, whispered soft reassurances. He had known. And that's when something inside her snapped. 1. April 14th, 2024. Rebecca waited until after dinner. Daniel was reading in bed, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. She stood in the doorway, holding a stack of printed medical records. Explain this. He barely glanced at the papers. Where'd you get that? He asked, his voice eerily calm. Rebecca felt her blood turn to ice. There was no confusion in his tone, no shock, no fear, because he already knew what they said. You had a vasectomy, Daniel, 8 years ago. He sighed, setting his book down. I didn't think you needed to know. The words sliced through the air like a blade. Rebecca stared at him, waiting for something, anything that might make this better. A confession, a plea, some sign of regret. But there was nothing, just mild irritation, like she had interrupted his evening for something trivial. You let me think it was me. Daniel sighed again. Rebecca, don't do this right now. A slow, creeping rage coiled inside her, a rage that had been building for 8 long years. She turned away from him, her movements slow, deliberate. Her hands trembled as they reached for the nightstand drawer, wrapped around the cold grip of the 9mm Glock, Daniel's gun, the one he always kept for protection. By the time he realized what was happening, it was already too late. The gun felt heavier than she expected. Rebecca's fingers tightened around the grip, her heartbeat slowing, not out of fear, but out of something else, something colder. Daniel was still sitting on the bed, calm, his glasses perched on his nose, his book still resting on his lap. Maybe he didn't believe she would do it. Maybe he thought she was too weak. Rebecca raised the Glock. Rebecca, he said, voice calm, firm, as if he still had control, as if he still held the power, as if she would listen. She pulled the trigger. Bang. The first shot hit him in the chest. Daniel's mouth opened in silent shock, his body jerking backward onto the bed. His book slipped from his fingers. Bang. The second shot. Close range. His breath hitched. His hands clutched his chest, warm blood spilling between his fingers. The preacher who had spent his life lying now couldn't find the words to speak. Rebecca stepped closer. Their eyes met, and in that moment she realized he wasn't scared. He was angry. Angry that she had figured it out. Angry that he wasn't in control anymore. Rebecca tilted her head. The gun was still warm in her grip. A lifetime of lies, and now silence. It wasn't enough. Not yet. She raised the gun one last time and placed it directly against his forehead. His expression flickered, just for a second, fear. Then, bang. The room fell silent. A slow trickle of blood spread across the mattress. The book on the floor was still open to the last page he had been reading. Rebecca inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the weight of what she had done. She didn't regret it. She didn't feel anything at all. And that was the most terrifying part. 8:42 p.m. Rebecca picked up the house phone, dialed 911. She didn't wipe her hands. She didn't change her clothes. She just waited for the dispatcher to pick up. 911, what's your emergency? Her voice was steady. Flat. He lied to me. He lied to me for 8 years. She set the phone down on the floor and sat beside Daniel's lifeless body. She didn't cry. She didn't move. The blood on her hands was starting to dry. Outside, a dog barked somewhere in the distance. A car drove past the house. The world kept going. But for Rebecca Whitmore, everything had already stopped. By the time law enforcement arrived, the crime scene was perfectly still. Rebecca didn't flinch when they surrounded her, didn't blink when they read her rights. The murder weapon, Daniel's own 9mm Glock, was on the floor beside her, still warm. Gunshot residue covered her hands. Blood had soaked into her jeans, splattered across her blouse. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no defensive wounds on Daniel. Just 3 precise gunshots, 2 to the chest, 1 final shot, execution style. This was not a crime of passion. This was something else, something colder. Rebecca let them lift her to her feet. She didn't resist. She didn't ask questions, didn't plead for mercy. She simply walked out of the house for the last time. The courtroom was silent when Rebecca took the stand. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer, someone who had planned this, someone who had known exactly what she was doing. She didn't cry. She didn't even try to explain herself. She sat beside his body, calm, waiting for police. That's not grief. That's premeditated murder. But the defense told another story. They painted Rebecca as a woman who had been pushed beyond her breaking point, A woman who had spent 8 years suffering, blaming herself, torturing herself over a problem she never had. A woman who had been gaslighted, manipulated, and emotionally destroyed. Was this murder, or was it justice? The jury was faced with an impossible question. Was Rebecca Whitmore a cold, calculating killer, or was she a victim who finally snapped? The evidence was undeniable. She had killed him. There was no doubt. But was it really murder, or was it something more? A woman betrayed, a life built on deception, a truth buried in blood. What would you have done?